Hello friends, my name is Aisling and welcome to my channel. I'm here today to talk about books as per usual, and more specifically I'm here today to do my quite belated June wrap up. The reason it's quite belated is I actually don't like doing wrap up videos because they require a lot more focus and a lot more memory than I am capable of, to be honest. So I'm gonna wing it a little bit this time because that's the kind of person that I am. So I read 11 books in total in June. Bit of a mixed bag as per usual, and a lot of them were library books. I think I only read 3 of my own books, which I need to work on because my physical TBR is bleeding massive. So without any further ado, we'll get cracking. So the first book that I read was The Last House on Needless Street by Katrina Ward. I know that a lot of people have really strong feelings about this book in that they love this book. I thought it was grand. It was a bit of an easy read. I got through it quite quickly. I didn't see things coming, I will say that. I did not predict the couple of twists and turns in it. So we follow a story in which a child goes missing at a lake during the summer when she's there with her family, and her older sister is with her at the time that she goes missing and feels quite responsible and spends a lot of her life since then trying to track down her little sister. So near this lake is a forest, and on the other side of this forest is a man who lives alone, who is quite isolated and who just seems by all accounts a bit odd, and he is suspect number 1 according to this missing girl's older sister. There are multiple points of view in this story, so we even have one from the perspective of a cat, which was quite interesting. Seemed a bit gimmicky but plays in well to the totality of the story by the time you get to the end. As I said, I really didn't see the twists and turns coming, so that was great. And I just didn't expect the story to kind of go where it did or to deal with what it did. So definitely there are some trigger warnings that maybe certain people might want to check in on. I did enjoy it. I just didn't love it either. I gave it 3 stars. I just think this type of book isn't my bread and butter. It's not what I love. I enjoy, but it's not what I love. I would read more Katrina Ward books based on this book, but as I said, I didn't love it. But the next book I definitely didn't love, and that was Horror Store by Grady Hendrix. Now this book I don't actually have the physical copy of at the moment, but it is laid out to look like an IKEA catalogue, and I loved the gimmick of it. It was the gimmick of it that I was really attracted to, and to be fair, it did look like an IKEA catalogue. But at the end of the day, it was pretty much a subpar novel. It follows a group of people who are working in a store that is like an IKEA store, and there are some unusual goings on in the store at night, and they find some things kind of upset in the store in the mornings and they want to figure out what's going on. So a few of the staff decide that they're going to stay overnight to see what's going on, what's happening. And I will say, for a horror novel, there was a bit in it that kind of did get me a bit creeped out, but for the most part I just didn't really enjoy it. I just didn't see anything too novel or too interesting in it. The main draw for this was definitely the fact that it did look like an IKEA catalogue, but you kind of get over that pretty quickly. I think I gave it 2 stars. Maybe I was a little bit generous, but I did finish it, so you know, at least we can say that much. The next book then that I read last month was City of Ashes by Cassandra Clare. If you have been following along, I have been reading the Mortal Instruments series for the first time ever, and last month it was the second one then that I read, and then the month before was the first one. So this month I will be reading the third one, but anyway, on the second one, which was City of Ashes by Cassandra Clare, we start into this novel and we pretty much pick up where we left off. Clary is in a relationship with somebody. I'm not going to say who that is because that's a spoiler, and she is living with somebody after some incidents that have happened in the first novel. Again, I don't want to say too much. So our main villain is AWOL, and there's this huge climax toward the end of the story, but there's really not a lot that I can say. It's kind of a lot of more of the same, but the stakes maybe feel that little bit higher, and I feel like maybe I enjoyed this one a little bit more than this first one. But maybe that was just a case of kind of, I went straight into it. I was familiar with the characters, the setting, you know, the magic systems. I didn't have to really concentrate. It was just like this easy read. It was something a bit fun. I did enjoy it, so I'm happy enough to continue with the third book in July. Lately, I feel as though I want to find a book that is like a book called Sorcery of Thorns, written by Margaret Rogerson. There was something about that book that made me feel very cozy and just like I loved books, and I can't really describe the feeling that I had, but I really want to get that feeling again. Now lately I have purchased a couple books that I think might maybe be on the same kind of wavelength, but who knows, I haven't read them yet. But I did decide to read another book by Margaret Rogerson, and that was called Vespritine. So we follow a girl who has, shall we say, quite an interesting background. So she ends up in what is essentially a nunnery. She is training to become like a nun. Things transpire, and as often happens in these novels, our protagonist is special in some way or another. I don't want to say too much, but she ends up with a friend who is a little bit unorthodox and who everybody believes is evil, but she knows is probably not. And she has to kind of figure out what's going on because she knows there's something dodgy going on somewhere, and her journey is quite perilous and there's a lot of people at stake, and it's kind of one of those books in which she is the only person that can save everybody. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I'm deliberately not saying too much because I don't have a physical copy of the book, so I don't know what it actually says on the blurb, so I don't want to say anything just in case it's a spoiler. It was grand. It wasn't Sorcery of Thorns. I thought it was fine. Don't regret reading it, but I'm already kind of forgetting it, so it wasn't really anything special for me. And then the next book was a sequel, so it was Bloodmarked by Tracy Deonn. Now I read Legendborn last month, the first book in this series, and I absolutely loved it. I didn't enjoy it quite as much as Legendborn. I thought it was okay. I enjoyed it for the most part, but it did have a lot of the same things that I loved from Legendborn, which I've spoken about before. But I feel like this story relied quite heavily on kind of dreamscapes and that sort of thing, and I'm just not into that sort of thing. I don't know, it just felt a bit like abstract in a way, and it was grand, but it just wasn't what the first book was for me personally anyway. I know that people love Bloodmarked more than Legendborn, or they love it equally as much, but for me it just didn't quite hit the mark, which is fine, but I did enjoy it. I'm not naysaying it, like it's worth reading, and I'm looking forward to the third and final book in the trilogy. Okay, the next book was another thriller that I got from the library. It was a Riley Sager book. So I read Home Before Dark last summer and it creeped me out quite a bit. I decided I was going to read The House Across the Lake, even though I had come across quite a few reviews that were like, oh, I don't know, it wasn't great. And dear viewer, let me tell you, I don't know, it wasn't great. Don't get me wrong, in the beginning as I was reading it, I couldn't understand why people were so upset about this book. I was enjoying the setting and the characters, and I like books set in kind of the wilderness, shall we say. Well, it wasn't quite the wilderness. So essentially in this story, our protagonist is a woman who is living in a cabin on a lake, or an old family house on a lake, and across the lake is a house that's kind of all glass front, so you can kind of see into it quite clearly at night and see what's going on. And a couple move in there and she becomes friendly with the woman. This woman goes missing and she starts to think maybe that the husband had something to do with it, and she's trying to prove it, and it was all going fine, it was all going grand. And then we had the ending, and the ending blew it. It blew it. And that's all I'm going to say on that. Next book was a book called Angel Fall by Susan E. So this was a book that was self-published, I think, and it was published over a decade ago. When you're reading it, you can feel it. You can feel that it's a little bit dated. So we enter into a world where we follow Penryn and her mum and her sister. So in this world, angels have come down from heaven, and it's basically an apocalyptic world because of the damage that the angels have wreaked, and we don't really know why the angels have done this, what the story is. It was an interesting kind of perspective, because normally, you know, an angel is a great, like, really good character and would never destroy the earth or kill any humans or whatever. So I did find that quite interesting. So Penryn is a teenage girl, and then she has a younger sister, and her younger sister is a wheelchair user, so she has a disability. So I'm always good for that disability rep. And then her mum is living with schizophrenia, so there is talk about mental health, mental illness as well. But as I said, this book was written over a decade ago, so the dealings with disability and the dealings with mental illness and mental health came across as quite a bit dated, and maybe nowadays might be seen as quite offensive. There were some interesting concepts in here, a bit of romance. The stakes were quite high, but for me personally, it was another miss. It was another miss. But what wasn't a miss then was the next book that I read. So I have been reading the Poppy War trilogy, and I'm glad, delighted, and also a little bit saddened to tell you that I have finished reading it. So the last book in the trilogy was The Burning God. The Dragon Republic, which was the middle book, I gave 5 stars. Phenomenal. The Burning God, I gave 4 stars. Thought it was great, but I thought what this book did was really important, because not to say that the Poppy War trilogy romanticizes war, it doesn't. It's quite dark, it's quite harrowing, but I feel like The Burning God really draws attention to kind of the aftermath of war, what happens to the average person. And then also I felt there was an awful lot of like traversing the land in this book, which I felt was important as well, rather than being like, oh, I'm going to cover this whole map really quickly. Just, I felt like this kind of brought to the fore these realities of war. Like there was so much in there that was so harrowing, so disgusting, and then, you know, maybe to win a war isn't necessarily this great outcome that you expect it to be. And I don't want to say too much because it is a sequel. The ending to this book is incredibly controversial, but let me tell you, I thought it was brilliant. I really thought it was good. I'm a little bit saddened by it because, you know, you want maybe the ideal ending, but I thought it was really good. I did think it was really good, and I am excited to go forward and to read Babel and also to read Yellowface. I feel like R.F. Kuang is the woman who can do it all, because she's done fantasy, she's done dark academia, and she has done kind of contemporary satire now as well. So I'm looking forward to seeing where she goes. So then I decided to read my second Grady Hendrix novel of the month, even after the failure of Horror Store. I'm not sure why I did that. Actually I am. It was because of the reputation of my best friend's exorcism. So I read it last month as well, and I expected a little bit of fun. I expected it to kind of just be a bit different from Horror Store, and thankfully it was. So it's set in, I can't actually even remember, was it the 80s or 90s? One of those, and we follow a group of friends, a group of female friends who are in high school, and it's incredibly nostalgic. It was just a lot of fun that way, in that, like, so I was born in 1989, and there was a lot in this that I was like, oh, I remember that. And you know, I grew up in Ireland, so I had a very different upbringing than somebody would have had in the States, but in terms of the technology and things like that, I definitely remember a lot of that. Basically, these girls, they're teenagers, and one night they decide to drop acid, and that's all well and good, and then they decide to go skinny dipping in the lake, but one of the girls goes missing and then doesn't show up until the following day, and there's something just a little bit off about her, but only her best friend seems to realise. and then the story transpires from there. It was a bit of fun. It was kind of heavily focused on female kind of teenage friendships, which I really enjoyed. I wasn't sure how I would feel kind of about all that, but it was lovely to kind of step back into that perspective. Interesting that it was written from Grady Hendrix's perspective, but nonetheless I enjoyed it. It wasn't the best book I've ever read, but a solid 3 stars. Happy enough with it. The next book then, and book number 10 that I read, was The Last Word by Taylor Adams. So this book is another thriller, and it's kind of been doing the rounds lately. It seems to be quite popular, and I just happened to pick it up from my library. So we follow a girl who is house sitting, so a house by the sea in a really kind of isolated setting. She doesn't really know anybody nearby. All she has for company is her dog. So she's been reading books and she's been leaving reviews then on, I think it was Amazon, except she leaves a review for a particular book and the author of said book isn't pleased with the review. So outside this house then things turn a bit strange. It seems like somebody might be coursing around the house at night, keeping a watch on our protagonist, and she starts to wonder if potentially it might be the author of this book that she gave the negative review to. So it gets quite dark quite quickly. It's quite violent. I felt like I was getting a whiplash from all the twists and turns. It was a whole thing. It was definitely a whole thing. And I don't know what to say about it really. It was fine. I didn't love it. It was an interesting perspective, I guess. It kind of drew me in because there was something that happened within the last year in which a girl left a review for a book on Instagram, and the author saw this review and kind of started to hound this girl online and kept telling her that her opinion was wrong, and it was all very bizarre. So then kind of I saw this book that seemed to kind of mirror that situation, although hopefully this book was a lot more bloody and had a more difficult resolution than the real life situation. I don't know how the real life situation turned out, so fingers crossed it wasn't quite the same as this book. But anyway, we're gonna move on. The last book that I read in June was The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. So it was my first Brandon Sanderson book. So it was my first episode of dipping my toes into the Cosmere. Loved it. Really enjoyed it. This book is over 1,000 pages long, so it's the first book in the Stormlight Archive series. So for the most part we follow a few different perspectives, mostly Kaladin, Shallan, and now I can't remember the name of the third character, even though Scan. But so it's written from a few different perspectives. The male perspectives were very manly, wrapped up in the physicality of war. I found that interesting enough, but there was a perspective. Shallan is a female and she is trying to receive an education from a woman called Jasna, and Jasna I thought she was such a badass woman. She's great, and I really liked their perspective, Shallan and Jasna. Now there is crossover between the stories. They're all kind of involved in this one particular war. I don't even know where to start with this. Like, there's so much going on here. Like, this is a really long book and it's an epic fantasy, and there's just different magic systems. The relationships are so intricate. The character growth is amazing. The plot is so good, but it's the kind of book that, like, it's such a commitment. And then there are many sequels. Oh, we won't say many, 4 or 5. I wouldn't recommend this book to just about anybody, but if you are looking to delve into like a really long and solid epic fantasy, I would 100% recommend this book. Now, one thing I will say is that I have heard that maybe you should start with the Mistborn trilogy, and I didn't, but I might go back and start with that, and then maybe one day read all of the Cosmere novels. I don't know how he wrote all those because I feel like I don't have enough time in my life to read all of them, but I'll give it a go. I'll give it a go as somebody who doesn't really do very well at reading sequels. We'll see, we'll see. That's that. That's everything that I read in June. It was a mixed bag, as I said. It was definitely a mixed bag. A couple of books that I really loved, and that's what I'm going to take away from it, and the rest of them we'll just put aside, and that's fine. Different strokes for different folks. So let me know if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, or opinions on these books. Comment down below, connect with me on Instagram, Goodreads, Storygraph, whatever you use yourself. If you like, I'd love if maybe you could subscribe if you like this kind of content. If not, as ever, that's absolutely fine. I've been Aisling, and I hope you've been okay. You've been minding yourself, and I'll hope to speak to you very, very soon. Mind yourself. Bye bye.